When I reflect back on the original name of Statia, the name given by the Indians was Aloi, which means Cashew Island. And as I reflect, it reminds me how many cashew trees we had still in my younger years growing up on the island.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. In this episode, we travel back in time to a period before colonial rule to uncover the rich indigenous history of Aloi Island, land of the cashew. Long before colonialism ever touched the Caribbean, this island was home to the first inhabitants. In this episode, we learn about the lives of the early culture, their vibrant traditions, and the powerful roles women played in their matrilineal society, a society that left deep imprints on the land. Understanding this part of history can feel complex, especially with the various archaeological terms and time periods. Our goal is to paint a clearer picture of what life was like before colonial rule, and explain who these indigenous people were long before Columbus ever set sight on St. Eustatius. Mr. Richardson, St. Eustatius' heritage inspector and historian, explains to us the big misconception with the island's history.
Many people think the island history started with colonialism, but there were people here long before Columbus rediscovered the Caribbean. St. Eustatius, it's a very small island. It heads off the Caribbean arch chain, but it's not one of the big islands like St. Kitts or Dominica. What's interesting is that even though that it did not support large freshwater rivers or springs, it still had a 1,000-year period of being inhabited on and off by these tribes for a very long time, so long that they could have established themselves here. They built their Moluccas here on the area that we now call the airport, the Kulturvlakte. They also lived in that stretch, but there was also another Amerindian sub-tribe that were at Korokoro Bay, for example. We know from archaeological excavations as early as the 1920s, the way they collected fresh water off the top of their Moluccas, the way they had these large jars, their fishing culture, what they ate, and they even ate animals that are no longer found in the Caribbean Sea at all, like the Caribbean monk seal. What we do know that at some point, the now extinct Saladoid Amerindian tribe left.
To help us understand the island's indigenous history, we turn to Dr. Morsink, an archaeologist with over 20 years of experience specializing in Caribbean archaeology, particularly the pre-contact period. Dr. Morsink has spent significant time working across the region, including St. Eustatius, where he explored the island's rich archaeological past, and he will guide us through the fascinating history of Saladoid Amerindians, shedding light on their culture, their presence here on Statia, and through this insight, we uncover a deep layer of history that is often hidden beneath the island's colonial narrative.
There are three periods that you can differentiate. The very first period in the bigger Antillean area starts distinctly about 7,500 years ago, with some sites in Dominican Republic and some of the other greater Antilles. Those are very few and very far in between. It is really difficult because that first colonization you probably don't see archaeologically. It's 5,500 years ago. Seems to be a very big presence in the Caribbean. We call that the Archaic period. In the Lesser Antilles, 3,000 years ago is the point that you can start seeing people being present in a high quantity. Right across from St. Eustatius on Seba, Plumpis, there is a site about 3,000 years ago. That site suggests is that there are people that are very mobile. They're fishing and foraging, going in between islands and making a living by constantly moving around with resources, seasons, and the availability of whatever they are gathering through the islands. Then there's a big change about 2,500 years ago. A new group moves in from the Orinoco Valley, from Venezuela, and they go into the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico. These are called the Saladoid And these people are Arawakan-speaking people. That's the language. From an archaeological perspective, we can trace that through time because it is the pottery style that we recognize these people of. That material culture of Saladoid pottery, which is a very beautiful made, what we call white on red pottery. If you go into the Statia Museum in the basement, I believe, you can see a couple of very beautiful examples of that pottery style. That style starts to diminish around 1500 years ago. The designs change over time. That white on red changes to more red and orange colors with less designs on it. Instead of drawing on it, they are making incisions on the pottery. And then gradually, these groups appear to change from Saladoid into what archaeologists call Oceanoid period, that then eventuates between 700 and 500 years ago into the Taino culture in the Greater Antilles. And that pottery style, Boca Chica, some of those design elements, which are just often like lines with dots, that kind of pottery is found in the Lesser Antilles in much fewer quantities, often mixed with other pottery styles that are more native to the Lesser Antilles. Then around 1500 and post, you have the colonial period.
As Dr. Morsink explains, there were 3 distinct periods of occupation in the Caribbean. The first was the Archaic period, marked by some of the earliest communities in the region. Then around 500 BC, new groups from Belize and South America began moving into the Caribbean, including Arawakan-speaking people, known for making Saladoid pottery. They initially settled in Puerto Rico and the Lesser Antilles before spreading into the Greater Antilles. The third period began around 1500, with Columbus' arrival and the wave of colonization that followed. The colonial period saw the mixing of native groups with the African diaspora, shaping the Caribbean culture we recognize today. But long before these periods of migration and colonization, the indigenous people had their own name for this land, one deeply connected to its natural resources and environment. This original name offers a crucial clue to their intimate relationship with the land, influencing both their daily lives and their identity. So where does this name Aloi come from? Mr. Richardson sheds light on this question.
I think that is a beautiful thing. It goes back to what I purely said in the so-called age of discovery. People were traveling around, and we have our memory of that name to thank to a French missionary, actually, who was traveling the islands just before the Dutch came, before the island was colonized. He's traveling the islands, and he goes, I think it's what today will become Puerto Rico, so it was then called Boriken. He's traveling and he picks up from a tribe the name of some of the islands. And this island in particular is referred to as Aloi, which is extremely short compared to many of the indigenous names. What's interesting is the meaning of Aloi, meaning land of cashew or land of many cashew, or also translate in that native language to the land of the cashew tree. So either way you want to translate it, it refers to many cashews. I think that's interesting because when you look at the island now, a cashew tree is quite hard to find.
The Amerindian culture of Aloi Island was far more than a society of hunters and gatherers. These early settlers were creators, builders, and spiritual beings, with distinct traditions and beliefs. Their mark on the island is more than a historical footnote. It's a living testament to their resourcefulness. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They craft tools, pottery, and they had spiritual practices that we can still trace to this day. What power did Saladoid Amerindian women hold? And how did their influence shape the very fabric of their society? In this matriarchal society, women weren't just caregivers. They were key decision makers and leaders. from the way land was passed down through matrilineal lines to the roles in guiding spiritual and social matters, women held a significant and influential place in their society. This influence is vividly brought to life through the archaeological evidence revealing new insights into their lives. What have the excavations revealed about their presence and their powers? Dr. Morsink helps us understand.
There are a lot of problems with answering questions like that when you are an archaeologist and you're just looking at material culture, trying to deduct these very intrinsic social relations that normally are created on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, there are larger social structures at play that we can get at. One of those is kinship. There are a lot of ways how anthropologists look at them. I'm going to say what I think is happening. There are very good indications that the first Saladoid groups were establishing social relations within their family through the female line. They call that matrilineal. So you as a child, the most important person of your family is your mom, where nowadays it's often your dad's family is more important. Back in the day, not the case. And it's very interesting what kind of ramifications come from that. Your mother's brother is more important than your father in a lot of ways. And so your uncle, he's of the same family as you in terms of kinship. Your mother's brother, your mother are really important when you're talking about heirloom, if you're talking about land that goes through generations. That was all traced through the matrilineal line. There's also a good indication where people live. In the matrilineal groups, they look like that all the females live together. So you have one house with a lot of sisters with their extended family that all live together. One of the ways how you can trace that archaeologically is that houses are larger. There are good comparative studies that larger houses often are associated with local groups. The Golden Rock site has one of the biggest houses in the Caribbean. They're 18, 20 meters in diameter, so we're talking 60 feet, circular houses, and probably all these sisters were living together with their offspring, probably with their brothers, close to each other, but the core of the group was the sisters and the grandmas that all belonged to the same female line. So the social cohesion of any group was with your female kin. I would say the importance of women was probably higher than now because you grow up with that as your main focus, because that's who you relate to, who you're going to get an inheritance from. If you produce something for your family, it's for your female line. This kind of living together creates that men are way more mobile because they don't need to necessarily stay with their family because they are more focused on their sister's children. They would be moving between where they are probably have their wife and where they have their sister. If that is like in the same village or a couple of villages down the road, or maybe even somewhere completely different, they are mobile. If you think about it in an early colonization, that is perfect because you're establishing new villages, you're trying to make a living. If one of their sisters or even their wives don't go well, they have enough social contacts and big social networks to put everybody and say, let's go somewhere else and make sure that we don't die of hunger or because there's a hurricane here. So let's go over here. They are creating this network. The females are probably much more stationary in one location because they have that family connection to the house, to where they actually live.
Where women were the heart of their communities, passing down wisdom, land, and leadership through the female line. This way of life stands in stark contrast to the patriarchal systems many of us are familiar with, where the quiet power of women often goes completely unnoticed. But what does it really mean to live in a matrilineal society, and why is it so important? Dr. Anishanslin, historian and professor, deepens this reflection, guiding us to appreciate the beauty, complexity, and resilience of these societies and cultures that European colonizers trapped in their own patriarchal views, could never fully understand.
One of the things that is important about matrilineal societies is that it automatically creates a situation where women are not going to be conceived of as legal property of men in the same way they are in European legal systems at the time of contact and settlement. The idea that it's important who your female ancestors are is automatically going to establish a society where women are respected in ways that they aren't respected in a patrilineal society. It just sets up a different dynamic from the start. It creates a society which is men and women have often very gendered roles, just like in European and Euro-American societies. But there's not so much of a distinctive system of power in which women are always seen as somehow inferior to men, because women are respected as elders, as the keepers of memory, the keepers of the land, which I think is really an important point. Also, the division of labor is not always the same in matrilineal societies as it is in European societies. This is something that European societies don't understand, just because the landscape doesn't look like their landscape of fields, that it doesn't mean that indigenous people aren't growing things. Of course they're growing things. They just have different patterns of agriculture. And so I think matrilineal society really means that it's one of the things that sets up a fundamental cultural clash between indigenous and European people when they come into contact. Because even Christopher Columbus, who is not just sailing for a king of Spain, but a queen of Spain, Isabella is queen in her own right of her own country that then becomes part of larger Spain. But even he can't conceive there would be societies where all sorts of women would have this type of power and respect and cultural capital. In much the same way that European settlers do not understand indigenous land use, they also don't understand indigenous gender ideas and relations, and it causes some real problems. One of the things you see in matrilineal societies in very interesting ways, and this is a huge generalization, is that there's a very different understanding of a woman's body and what it is and what it should do. For example, a woman should be shamed for making sexual decisions or a quote-unquote lack of clothing. By the time the Christian European world that spawns the age of exploration and then the rise of settler colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, these are people who think that nakedness is a sin and shows a lack of civilization in their eyes, and that women should not be having sex outside of marriage, and if they are, it's sinful. All of these things are things that want to keep women in their bodies in a very tightly controlled conception. If you look at, for example, there's an artist called Brunius, and he did a painting of, it's called A Family of Carib Natives. He was active in the 1760s and 70s. And it shows the family, men and women and children all together. The men and women are adorned differently, but they have a similar lack of clothing. And that's indicative of the fact that this is a society in which women's bodies are not seen as shameful in the way that they're seen in patriarchal societies. And again, this is something that has had very long-standing ramifications into our present day. There are still ideas about dress codes, or the idea of how short is a skirt for a girl to wear to school. I firmly think that if we had a matrilineal society, these questions would not be coming up in quite the same way. So that was a very broadly across space and time. But I do think the matrilineal nature of a lot of indigenous societies, including the Carib society, was at the heart of a lot of the cultural misunderstandings between Europeans, Amerindians, and the Europeans' inability, for most of them, to see beyond their own patriarchal system.
Dr. Anishanslin emphasizes how matrilineal societies fundamentally differ from European structures, especially in their treatment of women. In indigenous communities where lineages and land passed through the female line, women held significant respect and authority as keepers of memories and guardians of the land. This created distinct gender roles, but without the rigid hierarchy seen in European patriarchies. To European settlers, unfamiliar with this system, these societies appeared confusing and even really challenging to their norms. These differences also led to the misunderstanding of Amerindian practices as European settlers often misjudged indigenous social structures as primitive due to their own limiting perspective. Given the importance of matrilineal lines in Saladoid Amerindian societies, what archaeological evidence on St. Eustatius can help us understand on a deeper level the influence of these women? What have the excavations revealed about their presence and their power? The island's archaeological site, such as Golden Rock, offers valuable clues into how these women lived and ruled.
What's beautiful is that quite recently on St. Eustatius, we repatriated about 200 boxes from University of Leiden. What I know about the role of Amerindian women in the community ties back into one of the repatriated objects, the human remains of a young woman and her unborn child. And the care and attention that was given to this particular burial shows that to us historians, that women were really the mother figures of the community. Because even though the mother died before the child was born, it was probably about 6 to 7 months. The position that she was placed in is already motherly, crouching over that even in death, you're protecting your unborn child. That is something that image, you can't get it out of your head as an historian. And then you see within that grave, the mother is then protected by all of the pieces of shards, of course, but it was once complete bowls and plates and offerings, etc. That women played a major role. And what we do know from the larger islands in the Caribbean that had a larger Amerindian population, that oftentimes women had more responsibilities also within such a tribe. Women also hunted. That's also unique and shows the position that the predecessors to colonialism that occupied our island once had.
Mr. Richardson, retelling of the encounter with the burial of the young woman and her unborn child, shows us how deeply women were being valued in Saladoid Amerindian societies. Even in death, the care and attention given to them speaks to their significance. For the Saladoid Amerindians, spirituality and daily life were inseparable, and women stood at the heart of these practices, connecting their people to the land and the natural world. Through symbols like fertility and nature, their influence touched every part of their life, reminding us the powerful spiritual connection they embodied. But how far did their influence reach? Were they also leaders in governance? Dr. Morsink will guide us further into a profound relationship between women and leadership, helping us understand the deeper role they played in shaping their world.
As an archaeologist, you're grabbing all these tiny little bits from everywhere and trying to make a story out of it. I'm going to jump now from Saladoid to Taino for a little bit. The core of Taino culture is in the Greater Antilles. The main island was a Dominican Republic. When Columbus arrives, he is being guided by everyone to go to the center of Dominican Republic because that's where the big cacique, the big chief is. When you're talking about Statia in the Lesser Antilles, there are influences of Taino culture, but there are not like villages that have this material culture like in Dominican Republic.
During Columbus' second voyage, he brought with him a Jesuit friar named Ramon Panay, and he dropped him off in the Dominican Republic. A Jesuit friar, like Panay, was a member of a priestly society of a religious order, dedicated to missionary work. Ramon Panay was asked to live with indigenous communities to learn and to record their beliefs and customs. He provided a detailed insight into their practices, belief systems, and cosmology. Thanks to his observations, we know a lot about their culture.
Nowadays, anthropologists see a lot of similarities between what this colonist, Ramon Panay, recorded around 1500 in Dominican Republic and what you still see in South America.
Dr. Morsink highlights that in Taino culture, through Panay's documentation, we gain an understanding where women played powerful roles. This was evident in figures like Anacawana.
When Columbus arrives, they go to Dominican Republic. There's the big chief. But the big chief had also a wife, Anacawana. And everybody knew that she was just as important. Even though this is about 2,000 years later than the Saladoid groups, this matrilineal system, there was at least a little bit still in place. For Anacawana, one of the things that was said about her was that she was the owner of the house full of cotton, an economic product that was very important in that pre-contact period. She has access to this economic product and she owns it. That is pretty significant, and we should really not underestimate how important it is.
The power of women, like Anacawana, reveals the central role of women in both the spiritual and economic life of their communities. As the owner of a significant resource like cotton, a highly valued commodity at the time, Anacawana's role amplifies the influence and respect afforded to women in indigenous societies. Her legacy shows us that women's authority wasn't confined to the home. It extended into realms of wealth, cultural legacy, and societal power. This connection of power and respect is woven into the very fabric of indigenous societies, like those of the Saladoid Amerindians on Eustatius. Here, spirituality wasn't separate from daily life, but deeply intertwined with the natural world. Women's roles, along with symbols of fertility such as animals and plants, reflected a deep understanding of creation. But how did these connections influence their daily lives and their bond with the environment?
I mentioned that there is these early historic sources, and we have the anthropology from South America, and there are some consistencies. One of the consistencies is that, for instance, the color green, it's very much enmeshed with a female realm. For example, what we also see is that turtles are associated with females. You can think about turtles, for example, in a context of fertility. Everybody who lives on these islands and even beyond the islands knows that when sea turtles come out of the sea and come to lay eggs, they lay a lot of eggs. It's not 2 or 3, it's 200. And they go in the water, and then 2 days later, they come back and do it again. The concept of female and fertility is very much related to turtles. And archaeologically, what we find is sometimes little pendants of greenstone in the shape of turtles. So you can see that the color and the animal are the symbol of female fertility that people were exchanging. Another example is also greenstone axes. Sometimes they're very small, so you wouldn't be cutting a tree with it, but it could be a symbol of labor, female labor. So if you're in a matrilineal society, your labor and chopping down or maintaining gardens, creating houses or clearing fields was often related through the female line.
The cultural ties between these symbols and their everyday lives reflects a deep connection to nature. From the symbols they cherished to the tasks they carried out. The Saladoid Amerindians were surrounded by reminders of their shared rhythms with the island. What do these links tell us about their relationship with the natural world, from the way they designed their homes to the animals they honored in rituals? Their connection to nature was woven into every aspect of their existence. One powerful symbol of this connection was the turtle. Can we derive from these findings that the Saladoid Amerindians were deeply connected to nature, honoring it in their daily lives and spiritual practices? Dr. Morsink explains the connection between the turtle and the structures found here on Eustatius.
At the Golden Rock site, it was one of the very first archaeological excavations that was done to expose a larger area. It's one of the first in the Caribbean where the whole house platforms were exposed. I mentioned previously that they were very big, 18 to 20 meter diameter houses. But if you look from above, it looks exactly like a turtle from above. If you think about the shape of a turtle as like the quill or like a mountain coming out of the water, a house in the middle of the field is the same thing. So it's the structure, the shape of the house was one-on-one related to the turtle. During the excavations, one of the things that they found was a completely intact burial of a hawksbill turtle as well. This one wasn't eaten. This one was taken from the sea, brought to the village, and then buried there. If you know that the turtle is related to the female realm, that sisters living together in a matrilineal house, their house is shaped like a turtle. You can see that if there's a turtle that maybe passed away on the beach, that they felt a connection with this animal and gave him a proper burial.
As Dr. Morsink describes, the turtle-shaped homes and the burial of the hawksbill turtle shows their spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with the natural world around them. Much of the Saladoid Amerindian oral history has been lost due to the effects of colonization, but traces of their myths and tradition survive across the broader Caribbean. While Eustatius may not have retained specific stories, neighboring islands like Dominica still preserves cultural connections to their indigenous past. Folklore passed down through generations can offer us a glimpse into the belief system and the cosmology and the way of life that once defined these early communities. Beyond the physical structures, are there stories or myths that have survived the test of time?
The big issue is that the impact of early colonization on native groups was pretty severe. There are a lot of sources in the early 16th century that are already discussing that the whole islands were vacant, that the local population was non-existent. What I think is probably more accurate is that locals were much more aware of the impact of the colonists have on their lives and health, that they were staying as far away as possible. So, for instance, they would go into the high mountains, would have limited interactions. Folklore would have continued to be a thing up in the mountains, but not written down by Europeans because that interaction was just limited. If you look at, for instance, on Statia, the presence of anything pre-contact is absent, and probably was so with reason, because when the Dutch arrived in the early 17th century, there's no evidence that there were still groups living on the island. They either moved away or the local population just diminished by the introduction of diseases. Natives were also enslaved. So that kind of folklore and oral history is non-existent.
The loss of oral history brings up another intriguing question for us to consider. What really happened to the indigenous population when the Dutch arrived? Could the Saladoid Amerindians still be living here on Eustatius at that time? Although early colonial records often describe the land as uninhabited, we have to wonder, were these accounts crafted to justify European occupation? Is it possible that indigenous communities, sensing the threat of encroaching colonial powers, chose to retreat to more remote areas or even to larger neighboring islands? So the history of Eustatius before colonial rule is complex. It's layered, and it's often untold. While much of the indigenous story was lost over time, it is highly plausible that these groups were still here when the Dutch arrived, choosing perhaps to flee rather than face the harsh reality of colonization.
There's always more information out there. For instance, at the University of Martinique, they have started a program a few years ago where they to French Guiana had native groups rebuild a canoe like what we think what canoes look like in the Caribbean. And they started just trying, like with trained people, trying to paddle between islands and see what would work and what wouldn't work, just to engage with that portion of pre-contact life, which canoes must have been super important because that's what connects you to everybody else, and to see how it works. Because we can guesstimate or see how things go by computer models, etc., etc. but there's nothing more than just to do it and see what you learn from trying to paddle a canoe between Martinique and St. Lucia, for example. Didn't go so well. It's difficult. There are just places where you can flat to and not be in contact with the colonists who often stayed along the beaches in the flat areas for sugar plantations, etc., etc. In Statia, because it's so small, you don't have that opportunity that much, except for maybe going into the quilt. So it's very well possible that they were aiming to move to, for example, some of the larger islands like St. Lucia, Dominica, or Guadeloupe, where it's easier to not be in contact with a colonial power that wants to establish itself on the shores. And that's very well possible. A European ship is much larger than a canoe, and you can see it from far away. And people on Statia are always looking at the sea and what is going on. So if you're already that oriented towards the sea, and now there's suddenly a bigger European ship going for it and traveling, I'm sure people were aware before they landed what was going on.
So we know that St. Eustatius' heritage began with the indigenous tribes and societies who lived on the island long before European contact. They had organized matrilineal communities, a deep connection to the land, and a way of life that thrived for generations. By the time Columbus first sighted the island in 1493, these indigenous societies were already fading, or at least that's how the colonial history likes to tell us. And then just 2 centuries later, when the European colonizers began settling here, it seemed like these once flourishing matrilineal societies, where women led, owned land, and guided spiritual practices, had just disappeared. So what really happened to them? There are stories and theories of disease, enslavement, violence, or assimilation. But the truth is, we don't have all the answers. This chapter of our history remains largely unwritten. The most intriguing mystery lies with the women of these societies. Far from being just caregivers, they were the heart of the community, leading families, managing land, guiding spiritual practices. The women played a central role in shaping their societies. But perhaps the most profound question is, what happened to their stories, their influence, their legacy? One day, with more research and discoveries, we may be able to piece together the untold stories here on St. Eustatius of these indigenous matrilineal societies. But for now, their legacy remains one of the island's greatest untold stories, waiting to be uncovered.